Today's date is September 23rd, 2020, and we are in the midst of a COVID pandemic and in the midst of a very important election. Ruth Bader Ginsburg just died, and there was an earthquake that evening, the sonic boom when she left the earth, so that's what's going on in the world. There's a huge connection between COVID and HIV. I and my friends who were there in the 80s doing AIDS work have repeatedly said, "Oh my God, what does this remind you of?" It reminds us of the 80s when we were all, wondering how was it transmitted and whether we would find a vaccine and whether there would be a cure or a way to manage the disease. All of those questions, and people with AIDS, particularly like myself, were isolated and oftentimes just stayed home and drew the curtains because they didn't want to be infected with anything that might kill them. So it was a time of great fear and great danger, great anxiety, and great unknowns. I moved to Los Angeles right out of Northwestern because I thought I would start a career in film and TV, and that really went nowhere quickly. So I moved back to Chicago, where I had more connections, really, and it was there that I decided to go into the ministry. MCC is the Metropolitan Community Churches, and it's a denomination that was founded in 1968 by the Reverend Troy Perry as a safe place for LGBT people to worship in the Christian context. I was the pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church of Hartford, Connecticut, and was essentially the only gay activist there in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was there that I was, in some trip to Boston or New York, most likely, I was infected with HIV. When I started getting sick in '82, I was diagnosed with GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, and I moved out here to Los Angeles, and Dr. Joel Weissman took care of me. That was 2 weeks before Easter, and fortunately, my pastor, I was the associate pastor at MCC in the Valley at that time, and my pastor, Reverend Ken Martin, invited me to preach the Easter sermon that year. And I said, "Oh, no, you mean for me to preach Good Friday, don't you? I'm dying, And he said, "No, you need to preach Easter." And it was incredibly valuable to look at what it meant to me as somebody who was dying soon from this horribly stigmatized disease, what it meant to believe in the Easter message. And what it meant to me was that in spite of them having told me the worst thing they could possibly tell me, I discovered that I could still laugh, I could still sing, I could still dance. And I said to them, if God is greater than the death of Jesus on the cross, then God is greater than AIDS. And God is greater than AIDS was a phrase that I coined for that Easter sermon that spread like wildfire all over the place as a statement of faith that there is a greater reality than HIV and AIDS. The editor of the denominational magazine, Journey magazine, Paula Shaneweather, invited me to write a monthly column about my experiences of living with AIDS. And this was in '84 and '85. So there were a lot of people who literally did not know a person with AIDS. So I wrote those columns every single month, and it became a way of educating the denomination about what was going on with AIDS and what was needed in AIDS ministry. Churches really didn't want to have anything to do with it, and there were a lot of churches and synagogues that said that AIDS was God's punishment against gay people. and that it was God's way of getting rid of an undesirable population. Fundamentalist churches preached such judgment and made it so difficult for people with AIDS to come out and to get the care that they needed, because people were afraid of letting their families know. I mean, there was a joke that went around in the 80s among people with AIDS that what's the worst thing about being diagnosed with AIDS? Persuading your parents that you're Haitian, because Haitians were disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS in the early days. One of the first pamphlets that we published was HIV/AIDS, Is It God's Judgment? And of course the answer in our pamphlet was no, absolutely not. God does not punish people with disease. God is with us in this fight against the disease. Many communities of faith began to minister to people with AIDS and to form ministries, but they really were following the lead of the metropolitan community churches because we were the first and perhaps arguably the most heavily impacted by HIV and AIDS. Probably a third of our male clergy died from HIV/AIDS, and a third of our membership. I proceeded to get sicker and sicker, and when I did live to see 1985, my doctor invited me to be the first patient to go on the first antiviral tried against HIV and AIDS, and that drug was called Suramin. And it was an experimental chemotherapy, and I was patient number 1 on the trial. The trial lasted for about 9 months. It actually killed a number of the people who took it, and it was extraordinarily toxic and very nearly killed me. It caused my adrenal glands to blow out. I was legally blinded by it. I was paralyzed on the left side of my body. I wasted away to a skeleton again, and everybody kind of gave me up for dying. HIV was successfully suppressed, the HIV activity in my system, and my own immune system kicked back in, put the stage 4 lymphoma and Kaposi sarcoma into complete remission. And that was May of 1985, and they have remained in remission to this day. The disease manifested itself in me with Kaposi sarcoma lesions, which are cancer of the blood vessels in the skin or under the skin and on organs. Often it goes through the internal organs, and that's what eventually killed people with KS, was when the Kaposi sarcoma lesions went to the organs, the vital organs, and it could be a horribly ugly disease because you were marked with purple lesions. And I remember in 1985, Bill Meisenheimer, the executive director of APLA, asked me to pick some people with AIDS to ride in the car at the head of the APLA contingent of the Christopher Street West Parade, the Gay Pride Parade in West Hollywood. And I found a couple of the other guys who were taking Suramin, but the fourth person I picked was somebody named Mace, who had Kaposi sarcoma all over and whose face was covered with lesions. And he arrived at the parade with a white hat and a veil over his face so people really couldn't see it. And I said to him, maybe if you took your veil off and your hat, you would let people see what AIDS looks like when it's manifested as Kaposi sarcoma. And like it says in The Color Purple, it really pisses God off when you walk by the color purple and you don't notice it. So maybe you could take a look and see and let it show. And he did. He took his veil off and he took his hat off and he rode down the parade, and people were just enormously affected by that. I mean, you could see people crying on the side. A lot of people came up and touched him and thanked him, and he was just overwhelming. There were also people who were terrified and who turned away, who saw it and were like, you know, deeply affected by it and couldn't look at it. But most people had this very positive response to him. And at the end of the parade, he was beaming. He was happy the way I hadn't seen him in a month or 2 or 3. You know, he was just so happy and so fulfilled. He was filled with joy. And unfortunately, he died a couple weeks later, but he had that moment in the sun. I had been with a lot of people when they died. I was a chaplain at the Chris Brownlee AIDS Hospice. I knew from my own experience that, you know, there was a lot of fear, and there was a need to talk about, for many people, what would happen to them when they died. I had any number of different people who were dying talk to me or ask me, am I going to hell, Pastor? And this was because they believed that they were, because they were gay. And I said, no, I don't believe that at all. God loves you just the way you are, and you will go to heaven if that's where you believe you're going to heaven. And sometimes people would not believe in heaven, you know, and they believed that death was death, and that was the end, period. And I would always try to find out what people believed about the afterlife or the not afterlife, what happened at death, because then I could help them to have hope, even as they face death. And so I would talk about, you know, some of us heal into life, but then all of us eventually will heal into death, or hopefully heal into death. You do the work of healing, and it can lead you to life or it can lead you to death. But at least when you're doing the work of healing, you stand a better chance of dying at peace. If they didn't believe that anything happened after death, that death was the end, I would try to help them see that death would mean the end of their pain, the end of their struggles, the end of their suffering, that it would all be over and they would be released from that. I was invited to the White House for a prayer breakfast with Bill Clinton in 1993 when Clinton was president. And Clinton and Gore were there at the table, and there were 12 of us in leadership in AIDS ministry. Because I was the person with AIDS, I was seated on Bill Clinton's right for the breakfast. And the fella on the left was James Dobson, who, of course, was focused on the family and very fundamentalist. And he was telling Clinton in his left ear that, you know, AIDS is God's judgment, and, you know, he has a ministry that converts homosexuals to Christianity and then to heterosexuality, and that maybe stands a chance of healing their AIDS, you know. And on Clinton's right was this liberal, progressive, radical gay with AIDS, telling him, oh yeah, I've experienced quite a miracle. My cancers are in complete remission, and I got well. And I believe that it had a lot to do with God being on our side, you know. And Clinton was like, you know, going back and forth between the two of us. He tried to get the two of us to talk with each other and find common ground. I don't think that happened. I have asked that question many, many times. Why am I still here? Because a lot of people ask me that very same question. And I think that I know that I worked very hard at it. I believed that it could happen. My doctor told me when I was diagnosed with the 2 kinds of terminal cancer and AIDS that if 1 in a million people survive this, why not believe that you're going to be that 1 in a million and do the work accordingly, do the work of healing accordingly. And so I set out to do that, and I did survive against all the odds. I think that it's a variety of circumstances. Maybe it's genetics, maybe it's luck, maybe it's God, Who knows? But if, if it is God that saved me, why didn't God save all those other people who had more to offer this world than I did, you know? And so I don't know why I survived when so many others didn't. But I'm going to take full advantage of it, believe me, and live joyfully.